Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
It's kind of crazy to think about, but did you know that over 25% of adolescents have used illegal drugs at some point?
Wow, that is a pretty startling statistic.
Yeah, it is pretty alarming. But there is a bit of good news. That number has actually gone down since we went through the pandemic.
Oh, that is encouraging. It makes you wonder what's behind that positive shift.
Right. And it really makes you think about how we can keep that trend going. How can we better support young people as they're growing up and facing all these challenges?
It's such a critical time in their lives.
Absolutely. And that's actually exactly what we're going to be exploring today.
Yeah, we're diving deep into the world of digital interventions, particularly those that use games.
Exactly.
We're going to be looking at how these interactive technologies can be used to prevent substance use and encourage healthy development in those teenagers and young adults.
And we've got some really interesting information to share with you today from a variety of sources. Primarily, we're going to be looking at a comprehensive review that was recently published in the journal Children.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and this review looked at 26 different studies, all focusing on this topic of game-based interventions for adolescents.
A pretty significant sample size to draw from.
Right. And in addition to that, we're also going to be bringing in some insights from Mansu Yu.
Yeah,
He's one of the researchers who was actually involved in this review.
great.
And he shared some of his thoughts and perspectives in a recent health news article, so we'll be weaving those in as well.
Fantastic. So are we ready to dive in?
I think so. But before we get too far, let's be clear about what we're hoping to accomplish today.
Yeah, good idea. What's the mission for this deep dive?
Our goal is to break down what this research actually tells us about using digital games in this context. Do they really work? What are the factors that contribute to their success? And most importantly, what does this mean for supporting the well-being of young people in a practical way?
It sounds like we've got a lot of ground to cover. So maybe we can start by understanding the purpose behind this review of all these studies.
Yeah, you're right. What were the researchers actually trying to find out?
Well, they wanted to take a comprehensive look at all the available research on using digital games for adolescents when it comes to this specific issue.
Okay.
More specifically, they wanted to understand how these games can be used not only to prevent substance use, but also to assess it and even treat it.
So covering the whole spectrum from prevention to intervention.
Exactly. And they were also interested in how games could contribute to positive development in young people.
Okay, so not just focusing on the negative, but also fostering positive growth.
Absolutely. Think of it as trying to paint a full picture of how games can play a role in adolescent well-being.
So given that huge scope, how did they manage to tackle such a massive amount of research?
Well, they followed a very strict set of guidelines. It's actually a pretty well-known methodology called the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analyses.
That's a mouthful.
It is, right. But basically, it helps ensure that they're being thorough and consistent in how they select and analyze the studies.
Okay, so a rigorous process to make sure the results are reliable.
Exactly. They actually started with over 1,600 research articles. Can you imagine sifting through all of that?
It's a lot of reading.
It is. But they systematically narrowed it down to just 26 studies that met all of their very specific criteria.
Wow, so they really had to be selective to get it down to that number. So what were they specifically looking for in those final 26 studies?
They were interested in a lot of different factors, including where and when the research was conducted, what type of game was used, and what it was about.
Okay, so really trying to understand the context of each study.
Right. And of course, they were also looking at who the participants were, the young people involved.
Makes sense.
They wanted to see how researchers were measuring the results of the interventions, and most importantly, whether those interventions were actually effective in helping young people, and if so, what were the things that seemed to help them work well or not?
So kind of like trying to figure out the recipe for success, what makes these interventions work in the real world?
Exactly. So after going through all of that, what did they actually find?
Yeah, let's get to the good stuff. What were the key takeaways, especially when it comes to young people and substance use?
Well, across those 26 studies, they found that about half of them, 50% to be exact, reported that those game-based interventions were effective in actually reducing substance use.
So a promising start.
Yeah, it definitely suggests that games can have a real impact. However, there were also studies where the results were a bit more mixed. 16.7% found the interventions to be partially effective.
Okay, so some impact, but maybe not as strong.
Right. And a significant portion, 33.3%, concluded that the interventions were not effective in reducing substance use.
That's a pretty big chunk. So it seems like simply using a game doesn't automatically guarantee success.
Exactly. It really highlights the importance of looking at all those other factors we talked about earlier. The design of the game, the context in which it's used, the characteristics of the participants, all those things can play a role in whether or not it's effective.
So a nuanced picture emerging here.
It is. But what's really interesting is when we look at how these games influence young people's attitudes towards substance use.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Because it seems like shifting someone's mindset about drugs or alcohol would be a crucial step before we even see any changes in their behavior.
You're absolutely right. And in this area, the findings were more consistently positive. 65% of the studies showed that these game-based interventions were effective in changing attitudes towards substance use.
Oh, so a much higher success rate when it comes to influencing attitudes.
Yeah, exactly. 25% showed partial effectiveness, meaning there was some shift in attitudes, and only 10% found no significant impact at all.
That suggests that games might be a particularly powerful tool when it comes to shaping how young people think about these issues.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And what about that other aspect of their research? How these games could help with the broader positive development of adolescence?
Right. Let's not forget about that.
Yeah, because it's not just about preventing negative outcomes, it's also about nurturing positive growth and resilience.
Absolutely. So what did they find there?
Among the studies that looked at positive development outcomes like self-esteem or coping skills, 35.7% found the interventions to be effective.
Okay, so still a good portion.
Yeah, but a bit lower than the impact on attitudes. 50% reported partial effectiveness, and 14.3% found no effects on positive development outcomes.
So it seems like the impact might be a little bit less consistent when it comes to these broader areas of development compared to the more focused interventions on substance use.
That's a fair assessment. It's worth exploring those differences further to see what factors might be contributing to those variations.
So given those varied results, can you give us a better sense of what these interventions actually look like in practice?
Sure. So the review covered a whole range of different types of programs.
Okay.
The majority, about 57.7%, were what we call prevention programs.
So trying to stop substance use before it even starts.
Exactly. And about 30.8% were treatment programs.
Okay, so for young people who are already using substances.
Right. And a smaller percentage, around 11.5%, focused on using games as a way to assess issues related to substance use or positive development.
So kind of like a screening tool to identify potential problems or areas where young people might need support.
Exactly. So a really diverse mix in terms of how these games are being applied.
It is. And what about the technology itself? Were these all just simple apps on phones, or was there a wider range of game formats being studied?
Oh, there is definitely a lot of variety there. Mobile games were pretty popular, making up about 19.2%.
Okay, so accessible and convenient, something most young people have in their pockets.
Right. And then there were also games that used virtual reality and augmented reality. Those made up about 15.4% of the interventions.
Wow, so really immersive technologies that can create a more engaging experience?
Yeah, exactly. And those were just as common as web-based games and traditional video games that you'd play on a console or computer.
Okay, so using platforms that are already familiar and popular with young people.
Exactly. Computer-based games and tablet-based games were also used, but they were a bit less common.
So it seems like they were really trying to leverage all sorts of different technologies to see what worked best. What about the actual content of these games? Were they essentially just typical games with a health message kind of tacked on?
For the most part, no. The game content was often very intentionally designed for this purpose.
Okay, so not just a generic game with a PSA at the end.
Exactly. There were a lot of different approaches being used. Some of the games fell into the category of what we call serious games.
Okay, I haven't heard that term before.
So serious games are games that are designed with a primary purpose that goes beyond just entertainment.
Okay.
They're often used for things like education or training, and in this case, health interventions.
So the game itself is the tool for learning or behavior change.
Precisely. And there were also a lot of interactive games being used.
I can see how that would be engaging.
Yeah, these games required the player to make choices and then experience the consequences of those choices.
Okay, so a more hands-on approach that lets them see the impact of their decisions.
Right. And of course, there were educational games specifically designed to teach young people about the risks of substance use and to promote healthy decision-making.
So kind of like a fun and interactive way to learn about these important topics.
Exactly. And some of the interventions even used what we call gamification.
Okay, another new term for me.
So gamification is basically when you take elements from games like points, badges, and leaderboards, and you use those to motivate people in a non-game context.
Oh, I see. So like those apps that track your steps and give you rewards for reaching your goals.
Exactly. That's a form of gamification. And it can be really effective in boosting engagement and motivation.
So it sounds like they were really creative in how they used game elements to make these interventions more appealing and effective.
They were, and a lot of these approaches were also grounded in theories of behavior change.
Oh, interesting. So not just relying on intuition, but drawing on established scientific frameworks.
Right. For example, some of the interventions were based on social learning theory, which emphasizes the idea that we learn by watching others and through our own personal experiences.
So incorporating those social elements and opportunities for practice.
Exactly. Others use the theory of planned behavior, which focuses on how our intentions and attitudes influence what we actually do.
Okay, so targeting those thought processes that lead to action.
Right. And there were also interventions based on the attitude social influence self-efficacy model.
That's a mouthful.
It is, but essentially, it emphasizes how our beliefs about something, the social pressures we feel, and our confidence in our ability to succeed all interact to shape our behavior.
Okay, so a more comprehensive model that looks at a wider range of factors.
Yeah, and some interventions even combine elements from multiple theories.
So really trying to create a tailored approach that addresses the complexity of human behavior.
Exactly. So it's not just about throwing a game at a problem and hoping for the best. There's a lot of thought and science behind these interventions.
That makes sense. And I think it's important for our listeners to understand that this isn't just about mindless entertainment. These games are being designed with very specific goals and strategies in mind.
Absolutely. And now that we've gone through all that, I think it's a good time to step back and consider the bigger picture. What are the key takeaways from this research? Why should all this matter to our listeners?
Yeah, let's bring it home. What's the so what?
Well, one of the most significant takeaways is that young people today are what we call digital natives. They spend a huge amount of time online and using their smartphones.
That's not exactly breaking news.
No, it's not, but it's a crucial point when talking about health interventions. Mansu Yu, one of the researchers involved in this review, highlighted the fact that online games have a unique advantage in that they can reach young people where they already are.
Right, if you want to connect with them, you need to meet them in their world.
Exactly. And this is especially important in rural areas where access to in-person services for things like substance use prevention or mental health support can be more limited.
So these games could help bridge those gaps in access to care.
Yeah, potentially. They could offer a way to reach young people who might not otherwise have the opportunity to get support.
That's huge. So accessibility is a big plus.
Hmm.
What else did you emphasize as being important for making these games effective?
He really stressed the importance of personalization. He believes that the games that work best are the ones that are tailored to the individual user's needs and interests.
That makes sense. A one-size-fits-all approach isn't always the most effective.
Definitely not. And when you personalize an intervention, it becomes more engaging and relevant to the young person, which increases the chances they'll actually pay attention and learn from it.
So a game that adapts to the player's preferences and goals is more likely to have a lasting impact.
Yeah, exactly. And another important aspect is the social component. We know how important friends and social connections are during adolescence.
For sure. Peer influence can be a powerful force, both for good and for bad.
Absolutely. And the research, as well as Yu's insights, suggest that incorporating social elements into these games can really boost their effectiveness.
Like how?
Well, things like allowing young people to compete with their friends or family members in a healthy way, or setting up reward systems that recognize positive behavior and allow them to share their achievements, those kinds of things can tap into that natural desire for connection and validation.
It's smart. You're essentially leveraging those social dynamics to motivate them and reinforce those healthy behaviors.
Precisely. And what about addressing the underlying reasons why some adolescents might turn to substance use in the first place? Is that something these games can help with?
That's a great question. It seems like prevention efforts would be more successful if they tackled those root causes as well.
And it seems like the most promising interventions are the ones that do exactly that. They go beyond just providing information or teaching skills. They also include resources and support for healthy alternative activities.
So giving young people other options for coping with stress or difficult emotions.
Yeah. This could be anything from promoting involvement in sports or arts programs to connecting them with mentorship opportunities. The idea is to provide them with constructive outlets and to help them build resilience.
So not just telling them to say no, but actually equipping them with the tools and support they need to make healthy choices.
Exactly. And there's also some evidence that incorporating positive role models into these games can be very influential.
Oh, like characters in the game who are making healthy decisions and demonstrating those coping strategies.
Right. Young people are often very influenced by what they see, so having those positive examples can make a big difference.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've talked about the potential benefits, but do we have any specific examples from these studies of when these game-based approaches actually led to positive outcomes for young people?
We do. There were several encouraging findings from these studies. For instance, one study found a significant decrease in drinking behavior and overall alcohol use in adolescents who used a game-based intervention.
Oh, that's impressive. Actual changes in behavior.
Yeah, and another study reported increased rates of abstinence from cigarettes after participating in a game-based intervention.
So helping young people quit smoking, that's a huge win.
It is, and there were also several studies where the games led to an increase in knowledge about the harms of tobacco and e-cigarettes.
Okay, so arming them with the facts.
Exactly. And importantly, many of the games also fostered more negative attitudes towards using these products, which could potentially lead to reduced use in the long run.
So influencing those attitudes that we were talking about earlier.
Right. And some interventions even showed improvements in young people's self-efficacy, their belief in their ability to refuse substance use.
So not just giving them information, but actually helping them believe that they can make those healthy choices.
Exactly. And some games also helped young people develop better cognitive reappraisal skills.
Okay, break that down for me. What does that mean?
So, cognitive reappraisal is basically the ability to rethink a situation in a more positive or constructive way. It's a really important skill for coping with stress and difficult emotions.
So instead of getting overwhelmed by negative thoughts, they can reframe those thoughts in a way that helps them stay calm and make better decisions.
Precisely. And it seems like these games can actually help young people develop that skill.
That's amazing. So a lot of encouraging findings, but I imagine there were also some limitations to this research.
Of course, no research is perfect, and the authors of this review were very upfront about the limitations of the studies they analyzed.
Okay, good. Transparency is key.
Yeah.
What were some of those limitations?
Well, one important issue was geographic bias. The vast majority of the studies, almost 58%, were conducted in Western countries with a heavy emphasis on the United States.
So not a lot of representation from other parts of the world.
Right. And that raises the question of whether these interventions would be equally effective in different cultural contexts.
Yeah, it's important to consider those cultural differences. What might work well in one culture might not translate well to another.
Exactly. And that highlights the need for more research in diverse settings to see how these interventions might need to be adapted to be effective across different cultures.
Okay, so more research is needed there. Were there any other concerns about how the studies themselves were conducted?
Yeah, there were some methodological issues that are important to note. A significant portion of the studies used what we call convenience sampling methods, even within those studies that were designed to be randomized controlled trials, which are usually considered to be more rigorous.
Okay, so remind me what convenience sampling means.
So, convenience sampling is basically when researchers recruit participants who are easily available rather than selecting them randomly from a larger population.
Okay.
And while that can be a practical approach, it can also introduce bias into the study, which might make it harder to generalize the findings to a wider population.
So the results might not be as representative of all adolescents.
Exactly. So that's something to keep in mind when interpreting these findings. And another limitation was the lack of long-term data.
Okay, so we don't know for sure if the positive effects of these games last over time.
Right. A lot of the studies only followed up with participants for a short period, maybe a few weeks or a few months. So we need more research that looks at the long-term impact of these interventions.
Yeah, that's a crucial question. It's great to see improvements in the short term, but what really matters is whether those changes are sustained over time.
Absolutely. And it's also important to understand what factors contribute to those long-term changes. What helps those positive effects stick?
Right. What are the ingredients for lasting success?
And that's actually another limitation that the review highlighted. While some studies did identify certain features or elements of the games that seemed to be particularly helpful or unhelpful, the overall analysis of those factors wasn't as comprehensive as it could have been.
So we don't have a clear picture yet of what really makes these interventions work well or not.
Yeah, and that's definitely an area where more research is needed. We need to dig deeper and figure out what those key ingredients are.
And I'm also curious about potential risks or downsides to using these types of games. Did the review address that at all?
Interestingly, that wasn't something they really explored in depth. Things like the potential for young people to develop gaming addiction or concerns about privacy and data security weren't really addressed in those studies.
Yeah, those are important considerations. As we're increasingly using digital tools for health interventions, we need to be mindful of those potential risks as well.
Absolutely. We don't want to inadvertently create new problems while trying to solve existing ones.
So a lot to think about there. So bringing it back to the expert we mentioned earlier, Man-Soo Yu, what were his main takeaways from this research?
Well, he was really enthusiastic about the potential of online games as tools for prevention and intervention.
He sees them as a valuable resource.
He does. He highlighted, again, the accessibility of games and the fact that they're naturally appealing to young people. He reiterated the importance of personalizing those games, making them socially engaging, and incorporating those opportunities for positive alternative activities.
So really emphasizing those key ingredients we were discussing.
Exactly. And he's optimistic that this research can provide valuable guidance to game developers, helping them create more effective and impactful interventions.
But he sees this as a call to action for those who are creating these games.
He does. And what about the authors of the review itself? What were their main conclusions, and what do they think needs to happen next in this field?
Yeah, what's the path forward?
They echoed a lot of the points that you made, but they also emphasized the need for more rigorous research.
Okay, so tightening up those methodologies and ensuring the studies are high quality.
Exactly. They called for longer follow-up periods so we can better understand the long-term effects of these interventions.
Yeah, that longitudinal data is crucial.
Absolutely. And they also suggested that future research should broaden its focus to include a wider range of substances beyond just alcohol and tobacco.
Okay, so looking at other drugs that young people might be using.
Right. And they also stressed the importance of exploring more aspects of positive development, not just focusing on those traditional outcomes like
It's time.
self-esteem or coping skills.
So expanding our understanding of what constitutes positive growth and how these games can contribute to it.
Exactly. And they highlighted the need to adapt these interventions to be culturally sensitive and to make sure that they're relevant and appropriate for young people from diverse backgrounds.
So recognizing that one size doesn't fit all, and that we need to tailor these interventions to specific cultural contexts.
Exactly. And finally, they also called for future research to look more closely at potential negative consequences of using these games, things like the risk of addiction or privacy concerns.
So making sure that we're not unintentionally causing harm while trying to do good.
Precisely. It's all about being thoughtful and balanced in our approach.
So as with any new and evolving field, there's a lot to learn and a lot to consider. But I think the key takeaway here is that game-based interventions have a huge amount of potential.
I agree. And it really makes you think about how we can best leverage those digital spaces where young people spend so much of their time.
Right. It's not just about entertainment anymore. These games can be powerful tools for promoting health and well-being.
They can. And that brings us to our final thought for you today. Think about all the time that young people spend in those digital environments. How can we, as a society, move beyond just seeing games as a form of entertainment and start harnessing their engaging nature to encourage healthy behaviors and support positive development?
It's a big question, but an important one. What role can each of us play in advocating for the thoughtful design and evaluation of these interventions?
It's a challenge, but it's also an incredible opportunity, and it's something that we all need to be thinking about.
I completely agree. And to wrap things up for you today, I think the main message here is that game-based digital interventions show a lot of promise as a way to connect with young people on important issues like substance use prevention and positive development.
They do. But it's also clear that we need to be careful and intentional in how we design and implement these interventions.
Right. We need strong research to guide us, and we need to be sensitive to individual needs and cultural differences.
Absolutely. And we've really only scratched the surface of this topic today. There's a lot more to explore.
We encourage you to check out the full research article in Children, if you're interested in learning more.
Yeah, and the work of researchers like Mansu Yu is really pushing this field forward.
So stay tuned for more developments in this exciting area. And in the meantime, think about what this research means for the young people in your own life.
Yeah, how can we all contribute to creating a digital world that supports their health and well-being?
It's a question worth pondering. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration.
See you then!
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.